From Utah, Mr. Stewart is recognized for his questions.
Thank you, Madam Administrator, for being here today. I'm sure you've just enjoyed your morning. You've been looking forward to this for weeks, I know.
This is part of the public process, and I'm honored to be here.
Well, thank you, and I'm sincere when I say I think we recognize that you've worked hard to serve your country. But there are so many things that you and I disagree with, and that I believe that the EPA is working not for, but actually against the best interest of the American people. And some of those, not all of them, but some of them have been brought up today in this hearing so far. And let me just list a few of them quickly. New interpretation of navigable waters and with the Clean Water Act, RFS standards and the fuel blend well, new ozone standards that my friend Mr. Weber mentioned there very quickly. It's going to affect huge parts of the West. Hydraulic fracking and clean water, new standards for the human cost of carbon emissions, and standards that, as we've spent some time with talking about coal-fired power plant generation, all of these things, and there are others. Taken together, I believe that these new rules and proposals make life harder for hardworking American families. They take away economic freedom. They take away economic opportunity, I believe. And they have the effect of making Washington, D.C. more and more powerful and more central to Americans' lives. And I think, frankly, that they make the American people less trustful of Washington, D.C. and less trustful of the government. And I'm sure you have a sense of that as well. And very clearly, some of the questions and concerns expressed in this hearing today indicate that to you. But let me focus on just one of them if I could, and it's not a particularly partisan issue. It will affect Democratic and Republican districts. It will affect Democratic and Republican states. And I'll start with a very simple question, and that is, and it's not intended to be a gotcha question at all, but do you think it would be appropriate for the EPA to propose a standard that would be impossible to meet?
If it is a health-based standard about what is healthy and impacts associated with it, we need to rely on the science to say that.
Well, I understand, but again, would you propose a standard that would be impossible to meet? Would that be appropriate for the EPA to do?
It really depends on what the question is. If it's a health-based standard, you set the standard based on the health impacts.
But once again, Madam Administrator, if it's impossible to meet, it doesn't matter what your standard might be if it's impossible. And I think everyone would recognize that.
Well, we would not require the impossible, sir.
Okay, and I appreciate that, and that's what I was hoping you would say. And it wouldn't be appropriate for the EPA to set standards, for example, that are actually below naturally occurring background levels. And if I could call your attention to a slide, and I suppose you've seen this or something like this before, regarding ozone standards. The areas in red reflect EPA-controlled monitor counties where 60 parts per billion standard would be violated. The areas in orange indicate unmonitored counties that anticipate the violation of the 60 parts per billion. And look, if you see that, I represent parts of Utah. We've got, some of the most remote, they're very beautiful, but they're some of the most unpopulated areas of our nation. Zions Canyon, Bryce, Canyonlands. You could include Yellowstone National Park in this map as well. And yet, using Yellowstone as an example, naturally occurring ozone 66 parts per billion, which is above what some of the proposed standards are being considered. And I guess I would just ask you, are you aware that some of the most remote and in some cases pristine parks and parts of the country will have ozone that exceeds the range of this proposed standard?
There is no proposed standard at this point, Congressman. Let's just make sure that people aren't confused by that. But I would also say that I know the Science Advisory Board is looking at this issue with the staff so they can establish some recommendations to me moving forward, and we can take a look at these issues.
And I appreciate, okay, maybe there isn't a proposed standard. Maybe this is one of those issues that depends on what the meaning of the word is, and we could go back to very technical definitions, but there's certainly some consideration of a standard of 60 parts per billion. Would you agree with that?
I honestly do not know whether that is part of the consideration that
Okay.
the Science Advisory Board will advise me on.
Okay. In hearings that I chaired earlier this spring, we were very clearly told that that was a standard that they were considering, and in fact that they were not only considering, it was one that they were leaning towards. And we expected it to be the new proposed standard. I guess I would just conclude with this, my time being ended, and I wish I had more time. But there is nothing that these Western states can do to achieve that kind of standard. It will have great economic costs. By the EPA's own estimate, $90 billion. By some estimates, it may be 10 times that amount. And I would love to talk to you at another time about just the wisdom or the sanity, frankly, forget wisdom, just the sanity of the EPA proposing a standard that's impossible to meet, that would be incredibly expensive. And once again, coming back to my opening statement, and why that generates so much suspicion and so much ill will in the body politic of the American people. So with that, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart.